Zion with your carnal mind. Your carnal mind have to stay behind. Say you can't go on Zion in a crystal limousine. Your little limousine are gonna need gasoline. Your hands and your heart have to pure and clean. To rally round Selassie Heights, gold and green. Cause the wicked bound to fade away. Eden bound to fade away. Catilda said the wicked bound to fade away. Natty forward a room and Natty mash down room. She broke up the scissors and him broke up the comb. Cause some of them a talk about me here one comb. Cause Samson sword flipped him with a donkey job out. Cause the wicked bound to fade away. Catilda said the heathen bound to fade away. Do it, John. Say your little love will stay. But I'm playing you from the top to the very long so jump. But I miss my miracle on the pump because the king is on the top. But I play them jumbo bass and make you wiggle up your waist. I keep my miracles on the pump. Pieces on, but I really take you on the number one. So I lead the weak is on. Wow! Said the wicked bound to fade away. Catilda said the heathen bound to fade away. Yeah! Cause said the rise and shine and you give God the glory. Rise and shine and you give God the glory. Rock my soul in the bosom of Jah. Rock my soul in the bosom of Jah. She walk and talk with your love in your heart. You sleep and you wake with your love in your heart. But I give thanks and praise unto Jah. But the kings of kings and the Lord of lords. She conquer lion of the tribe of Judah. The elect of God, ever living God. She earth rightful ruler. Jah! Cause if you love Selassie, I say yeah! You love Rastafari, I say yo. Bang little ding, Selassie, he my God. So who said Jah jet said I'm what they must pray. So who said Jah no jet said I lie them a tell. You love Selassie, I say yeah. Selassie, I know. I'm a lover, no see.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today on Island Riches. We're taking you on a tour of Jamaica's south coast. Stay tuned while we take you around St. Elizabeth, through Black River, Junction, up to Spur Tree Hill. All you Jamaicans out there who come from that part of the island, you know what I'm talking about. Now, today, I've decided to let's see a little bit of a different piece of entertainment, if you wish. Today we'll be overlaying on this video an excerpt from Malcolm X's autobiography, an audiobook that I think that we all can benefit listening to. So bear with me, people. Just take time and enjoy the views and hit back. And listen to what Malcolm has to say to us. Don't be afraid to chime in the comment section and let us know what you think. Thank you for joining us on Island Riches. Yeah.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Chapter 1. Nightmare. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their shotguns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with her 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father's spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey, from his headquarters in New York City's Harlem, was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. My father was enraged when he returned. He decided to wait until I was born, which would be soon, and then the family would move. I'm not sure why he made this decision, for he was not a frightened Negro, as most then were, and many still are today. My father was a big 6'4", very black man. He had only one eye. How he'd lost the other one I've never known. He was from Reynolds, Georgia, where he'd left school after the 3rd or maybe 4th grade. He believed, as did Marcus Garvey, that freedom, independence, and self-respect could never be achieved by the Negro in America, and that therefore the Negro should leave America to the white man and return to his African land of origin. Among the reasons my father decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including 1 by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only 1, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was finally himself to die by the white man's hands. It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared. I was my father's 7th child. He had 3 children by a previous marriage, Ella, Earl, and Mary, who lived in Boston. He had met and married my mother in Philadelphia, where their first child, my oldest full brother, Wilfred, was born. They moved from Philadelphia to Omaha, where Hilda and then Filbert were born. I was next in line. My mother was 28 when I was born on May 19th, 1925, in an Omaha hospital. Then we moved to Milwaukee, where Reginald was born. From infancy, he had some kind of hernia condition which was to handicap him physically for the rest of his life. Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. Her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad that she'd never seen him. It was, of course, because of him that I got my reddish-brown, Marini color of skin and my hair of the same color. I was the lightest child in our family. Out in the world later on, in Boston and New York, I was among the millions of Negroes who were insane enough to feel that it was some kind of status symbol to be light-complexioned, that one was actually fortunate to be born thus. But still later, I learned to hate every drop of that white rapist's blood that is in me. Our family stayed only briefly in Milwaukee, but my father wanted to find a place where he could raise our own food and perhaps build a business. The teaching of Marcus Garvey stressed becoming independent of the white man. We went next, for some reason, to Lansing, Michigan. My father bought a house, and soon, as had been his pattern, he was doing freelance Christian preaching in local Negro Baptist churches, and during the week he was roaming about spreading word of Marcus Garvey. He'd begun to lay away savings for the store he'd always wanted to own when, as always, some stupid local Uncle Tom Negroes began to funnel stories about his revolutionary beliefs to the local white people. This time, the get-out-of-town threats came from a local hate society called the Black Legion. They wore black robes instead of white. Soon, nearly everywhere my father went, black legionnaires were reviling him as an uppity nigger, for wanting to own a store, for living outside the Lansing Negro district, for spreading unrest and dissension among the good niggers. As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the nightmare night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the 2 white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other, trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling our heads off. The white police and firemen came and stood around watching as the house burned down to the ground. My father prevailed on some friends to clothe and house us temporarily. Then he moved us into another house in the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. There's where Michigan State University is located. I related all of this to an audience of students when I spoke there in January 1963, and had the first reunion in a long while with my younger brother, Robert, who was there doing postgraduate studies in psychology. I told them how East Lansing harassed us so much that we had to move again, this time 2 miles out of town into the country. This was where my father built for us with his own hands a 4-room house. This is where I really begin to remember things. This home where I started to grow up. After the fire, I remember that my father was called in and questioned about a permit for the pistol with which he had shot at the white men who set the fire. I remember that the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking, or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and his shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other game. After that, my memories are of the friction between my father and mother. They seemed to be nearly always at odds. Sometimes my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know. But an educated woman, I suppose, can't resist the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. My father was also belligerent toward all of the children, except me. The older ones he would beat almost savagely if they broke any of his rules. And he had so many rules it was hard to know them all. Nearly all my whippings came from my mother. I've thought a lot about why. I actually believe that as anti-white as my father was, he was subconsciously so afflicted with the white man's brainwashing of Negroes that he inclined to favor the light ones, and I was his lightest child. Most Negro parents in those days would almost instinctively treat any lighter children better than they did the darker ones. It came directly from the slavery tradition that the mulatto, because he was visibly nearer to white, was therefore better. My 2 other images of my father are both outside the home. One was his role as a Baptist preacher. He never pastored in any regular church of his own. He was always a visiting preacher. I remember especially his favorite sermon. That little black train is a-comin', and you better get all your business right. I guess this also fit his association with the Back to Africa movement, with Marcus Garvey's Black Train Homeward. My brother Philbert, the one just older than me, loved church, but it confused and amazed me. I would sit goggle-eyed at my father jumping and shouting as he preached, with the congregation jumping and shouting behind him, their souls and bodies devoted to singing and praying. Even at that young age, I just couldn't believe in the Christian concept of Jesus as someone divine, and no religious person, until I was a man in my 20s, and then in prison, could tell me anything. I had very little respect for most people who represented religion. It was in his role as a preacher that my father had most contact with the Negroes of Lansing. Believe me when I tell you that those Negroes were in bad shape then. They are still in bad shape, though in a different way. By that I mean that I don't know a town with a higher percentage of complacent and misguided so-called middle-class Negroes. The typical status symbol-oriented, integration-seeking type of Negroes. Just recently, I was standing in a lobby at the United Nations talking with an African ambassador and his wife, when a Negro came up to me and said, "You know me?" I was a little embarrassed because I thought he was someone I should remember. It turned out that he was one of those bragging, self-satisfied, middle-class Lansing Negroes. I wasn't ingratiated. He was the type who would never have been associated with Africa until the fad of having African friends became a status symbol for middle-class Negroes. Back when I was growing up, the successful Lansing Negroes were such as waiters and bootblacks. To be a janitor at some downtown store was to be highly respected. The real elite, the big shots, the voices of the race, were the waiters at the Lansing Country Club and the shoeshine boys at the state capitol. The only Negroes who really had any money were the ones in the numbers racket, or who ran the gambling houses, or who in some other way lived parasitically off the poorest ones, who were the masses. No Negroes were hired then by Lansing's big Oldsmobile plant or the Rio plant. Do you remember the Rio? It was manufactured in Lansing, and R.E. Olds, the man after whom it was named, also lived in Lansing. When the war came along, they hired some Negro janitors. The bulk of the Negroes were either on welfare or WPA, or they starved. The day was to come when our family was so poor that we would eat the whole out of a donut. But at that time, we were much better off than most town Negroes. The reason was we raised much of our own food out there in the country where we were. We were much better off than the town Negroes who would shout, as my father preached, for the pie in the sky and their heaven in the hereafter, while the white man had his here on earth. I knew that the collections my father got for his preaching were mainly what fed and clothed us. And he also did other odd jobs. But still the image of him that made me proudest was his crusading and militant campaigning with the words of Marcus Garvey. As young as I was then, I knew from what I overheard that my father was saying something that made him a tough man. I remember an old lady grinning and saying to my father, "You're scaring these white folks to death." One of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings, which he held quietly in different people's homes. There were never more than a few people at any one time, 20 at most. But that was a lot, packed into someone's living room. I noticed how differently they all acted, although sometimes they were the same people who jumped and shouted in church. But in these meetings, both they and my father were more intense, more intelligent, and down to earth. It made me feel the same way. I can remember hearing of Adam driven out of the garden into the caves of Europe, Africa for the Africans, Ethiopians awake, and my father would talk about how it would not be much longer before Africa would be completely run by Negroes. By black men was the phrase he always used. No one knows when the hour of Africa's redemption cometh. It is in the wind. It is coming. One day, like a storm, it will be here. I remember seeing the big, shiny photographs of Marcus Garvey that were passed from hand to hand. My father had a big envelope of them that he always took to these meetings. The pictures showed what seemed to me millions of Negroes thronged in parade behind Garvey riding in a fine car, a big black man dressed in a dazzling uniform with gold braid on it, and he was wearing a thrilling hat with tall plumes. I remember hearing that he had black followers not only in the United States but all around the world. And I remember how the meetings always closed with my father saying several times, and the people chanting after him, "Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will."